I've been working for the last 40 years in the field of palliative care and hospice, and so working a lot with people who are standing in a gigantic cave facing into the great darkness of uncertainty of what's ahead. And I found this sort of sets of teachings that I've received on what's called terror management especially helpful in that setting, but I think it really applies to each of us as we go about our lives as individuals. And I think, as I'm going to talk about, I think it also applies to how groups react and how cultures react and how society reacts in the presence of fear. So understanding these dynamics, I think, is key. And terror management theory is a theory that was presented by three social psychologists, Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pazinski, many years ago now. And to understand those dynamics of fear. And what we're talking about is really, what Francis Bacon kind of put into words back in the 16th century, when he said that, men, women fear death as children fear going into the dark, that there's some deep existential dread of the unknown. And that's true for our egos also. The ego, that part of our psyche, that executive part of our psyche, that part of our psyche that in a way drives the car in terms of making decisions, everyday decisions, discriminations, initiating action. That's the ego. That's the useful side of the ego. But the ego, from a Buddhist point of view, is a construction of the mind. It's not something. It's not something that has a kind of a self-existing presence to itself. So that just as our body will die in death at the end of life, so the ego will also die. And so when the ego is approaching death, when the ego becomes aware of its own mortality, it behaves in a particular way because it doesn't like the prospect of its own finality and its own ending. And so that's what terror management gives us insight into, is how the ego behaves when faced with an existential threat. And it's based on the work, terror management theory is based on the work of Ernest Becker, an American I believe he was a psychologist and author who wrote this Pulitzer Prize-winning book called The Denial of Death back in the 70s. And it was based on the work of Freud and other depth psychologists. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said of it, it's one of those rare masterpieces that will stimulate your thoughts, your curiosity, and not least your soul. So really recognized as a kind of really seminal work. And what he talks about here is what he calls terror management processes. And the basic idea, again, is that once the ego is sensitized, something happens that brings awareness to the ego of its impending finality, of the possibility of death or annihilation. From the point of view of the ego, it's going to be the end. That's how it sees it. What that triggers, and all of this is unconscious. This isn't. None of this is conscious. These are unconscious defense mechanisms. But when the ego is sensitized, when it becomes, in their language, mortality salient, it triggers these terror management processes. And there are three main ways that the terrified ego can react. Firstly, it tries to reinforce the dominant cultural values because that's the status quo that it's used to, and somehow its own kind of continuity is wrapped up with those dominant cultural values. And so when it gets triggered and stimulated, it first of all acts to reinforce those dominant cultural values, and then if there's a new alternate culture that's somehow threatening or bringing in another point of view that is questioning those dominant cultural values, initially the ego will react to that alternate culture by trying to integrate aspects of it to kind of neutralize it in a way. But if that doesn't work, the third terror management process is distancing, denigrating, and destroying the alternate culture. And so these three social psychologists were kind of really trying to figure out why minorities in a particular society were persecuted. And so they came up with this particular theory as a way of understanding it. Because for the mortality salient, or the ego that's become sensitized to its own impending mortality, the goal becomes self-preservation at all costs. So the best way the ego says to do that is to maintain the status quo. Thinking becomes very rational, concrete, polarized, behavior contractive and disconnective. The ego says, we need to retreat here. We need to cling to what's familiar as if our life depends on it, because it does. And we need to denigrate, distance from, and if necessary, destroy what's unfamiliar and threatening life as we know it. And so they spent years researching this theory, where they would make a group of individuals mortality salient and then look at their behavior and compare that to a control group of individuals who were faced with the same questions or tasks but hadn't been made mortality salient. And again and again and again, they saw how at an individual level these processes played out. But then came 9/11. Then came that huge mortality sensitizing event, certainly in the American psyche, but I think, in many ways this was an international event, that sensitized, that kind of created this sensitization. And suddenly we saw, in the aftermath of 9/11, what's obviously didn't just happen for the first time at 9/11, it's been happening throughout history, but showed that these terror management processes also apply on a much larger scale. And we saw, Homeland Security and particular, minorities being persecuted in particular ways. And at the same time, everybody, holding up and waving the American flag. So reinforcing dominant cultural values, and then kind of more of three than of two, kind of distancing, denigrating, and destroying alternate cultures. And so I think what we see since then is that terror management is not really telling us how we behave as individuals, but how, if we look at a lot of what's happening throughout our world at the moment, with populist regimes, with kind of persecution of minorities, if we look at that through the lens of terror management theory, it actually begins to make quite a lot of sense. And so these are two little resources there if anybody's interested in following up. Flight from Death is a movie that's made about terror management theory. And then in the wake of 9/11, The Psychology of Terror is a book that these three psychologists, where they talk about the application of these ideas at a kind of a bigger scale. But here we are, again. I mean, we've given this talk before, and there were mortality sensitizing global events happening in the world at that time. Well, here we are on the, with the possible threat of war in Russia and Ukraine, and on the edge of Europe, and how that's kind of not just creating a kind of mortality salience when we hear about kind of exercises and nuclear exercises, and it's just so triggering and so sensitizing, not just throughout Europe but throughout the world. And ongoing extreme weather events. As we were chatting just before we started, hearing about another huge storm rolling through Ireland and England and Germany at the moment. on other parts of the world, forest fires, these extreme sensitizing events that just make us aware that with the kind of climate catastrophe that's unfolding, another huge global international mortality sensitizing events. And then, of course, there's the ongoing pandemic, one variant after another. I mean, let's hope Omicron is the one that kind of is going to lead us into a more benign version of coronavirus that we'll be able to live with moving into the future more easily, a bit like we live with influenza. But anyway, again, another huge global sensitizing event. And so at a cultural, societal level, it also plays out. We rely on much more rational, concrete, and polarized kind of positions. Our behavior becomes much more protective of the status quo, contractive, disconnective rather than connective, clinging to what's familiar, denigrating, distancing, and persecuting and destroying what's unfamiliar. So what's going on here? That these patterns of thinking and behavior, so-called terror management processes, lead to the cycle of polarizing, separating, isolating, othering, divisive, blaming behaviors that are destructive and that are self-reinforcing and self-perpetuating. That a bit like, one of these exercise wheels that one sees the rat or the little hamster running around in, running, and going nowhere. They don't lead to freedom, no matter how much we react. They trigger these processes. These processes then lead to certain behaviors that reinforce rather than allay the fear. So one kind of compound the fear leads to the behaviors, and it goes on in that kind of endless spiral that really is echoed in the Buddhist cycle of the causation of suffering, the 12 links in the chain of suffering. And this is one of the Buddha's great insights on the night of his enlightenment. And I'm not going to go into this in detail now, but the point is that the key point in this, and the point where we can come out of the cycle of one feeding the other, is by addressing ignorance. And ignorance here, let's just let Mary in. Ignorance here does not mean lack of knowledge. Ignorance here means lack of wisdom. And so that's where we want to kind of go next. And let's just imagine for a moment that there are two parts within us, and we might kind of see these as two different people within us. But there's a part of us that's terrified of death, and that's the ego. But there's also another part that's not terrified of death, and that's the wise one. So the one that's afraid, the ego, and then the one that's not afraid. And it all comes down to how we perceive reality, and how we perceive reality is also tied in with how we experience reality. So for the terrified ego, or to the ego, not just the terrified ego, from an ego perspective, reality is made up of separate particles or individuals that are very concrete and substantial and self-existing. And so the world is a series of interactions between these separate kind of entities that works in a very sort of linear way, like billiard balls, very concrete, very solid. One bounces off the other in that kind of linear causality. But that's very different to the perspective of how reality is through the eyes of wisdom. And through the eyes of wisdom, it looks a little bit more like this, that reality is more like a wave on an ocean, or waves on an ocean, to be to be more inclusive and accurate. And the ego is part of that, but the ego is really just, as the psychologist Carl Jung said, the ego is just like a tiny little cork floating on the very tip of the wave on the ocean. But there's so much more. There's so much more. There is the wave. There's the wave that is an entity, whether it's a tree or a rock or a person or a cloud or a river. There is a wave that is a discrete wave that's different to the next wave, that's different to the next wave. But underneath that wave is the field of awareness, the sacred ground of becoming that we are all part of, that we all arise out of, and that we all fall back into. And that is the view of wisdom, that all is flow, that all is wave. So wisdom coming into this other perspective, this other way of seeing, frees us from the cycle of suffering. Wisdom is the true antidote to ignorance. Wisdom means seeing reality as it really is. So how can we cultivate a fearless heart? Over to you.
So, thank you, Michael. This is wonderful. I might just add a few more words before we start our meditation. And yes, wisdom is important, but the question is, and compassion. So, how can we get to wisdom and compassion? And actually, I've been just working on an article. I think all of you know about my book, Heart Medicine, How to Stop Painful Patterns and Find Peace and Freedom. And how to see these, what I call LURPs, complexities, samskaras, long-standing, recurrent, painful patterns in society, and what can we do about it? And the one that's probably the deepest that you described here so well is the delusion of separateness. I think Tara Brach, or maybe she got it somewhere, coined that word, the delusion of separateness, how we feel we are so packed against each other rather than interconnected. And so what are a set of practices we can have that help us? Because it's not just pressing a button, now wisdom, it's unfortunately not as easy as that. And how first we have to recognize what's going on, and that's the first noble truth. It's about awareness, awareness that we have, I call it gotten lurped, that a long-standing, recurrent, painful pattern that fear has gotten us, and that we want to do something about it. It's like a medical model, unless we know we have a bug, we can't, take the right medicine. And so then mindfulness gives us an incredible tool, which is knowing in our body, thoughts and feelings that that there are phenomena like fear, like anger, like shame, like whatever is coming by, and that all of those are impermanent and passing through. And mindfulness giving us an incredible methodology. But we can see awareness as moment by moment, non-judgmental attention, as John Kabat-Zinn coined it, or we can see awareness as this field quality of awareness, something that is already there, that we can see in the face of this old monk gentleman. It seems, at least in my imagination, he knows that there is something that is already there we can tap into, something, an interconnectedness, a sense of interbeing, something that doesn't die, that's timeless, formless, that is always there. And in the meditation to come, I will try to give you a little taste of that, of the mindfulness moment by moment, and but also of that awareness that is already there. And then we need with that a lot of self-compassion. We are wired as humans in survival related but difficult ways. We are very tribal and we can't even help it. So to have not a condone and whitewash, but to have real compassion, warmth for ourselves and for our human condition and for others. We are all kind of wired in this way that we have to put a lot of work into it to counteract it and to hold a vision that freedom is possible, which is the third noble truth of the Buddha, where he says, yes, freedom is possible. Yes, here we are, but more freedom is possible. Slowly, slowly, we can be more free. And then to learn, somebody translated suffering with reactivity, to know that we can learn to notice when we got triggered and that there is a time to pause and that we can feel this in our bodies and bring awareness to it and notice when old patterns in us are triggered, and we can press the pause button and see ourselves with compassion. And we can learn to stay with our suffering, noticing, not just hopping with each trigger, but to hold that suffering, but know as we are holding the awareness, it's actually moving on like a people mover in an airport. If we just stay with it, things change. And there will be more freedom. And then to do whatever we can to let go of our resentments, let's say through forgiveness, again, not as whitewashing or as condoning, but just for finding freedom from the burdens that we are carrying. And then losing this grip of identification, which again can be done psychologically, but also through resting in this wider perspective of awareness. And last but not least, service. I think by helping others, by being there for others, by relieving suffering, we can be healed ourselves. It's not a martyrdom or a sacrifice. It actually helps us to be engaged because we feel more strong, more courageous, more efficient, there's more of a sense of connectedness and belonging, and there's more of a sense of efficacy.